2 innocent children, gone without a trace. A boy who always smiled. A teenage sister who swore she'd protect him no matter what. Their family claimed they were safe, that they were just somewhere else. But behind closed doors, rumors were swirling, neighbors were whispering, and police were watching every move. Months turned into silence, until the day detectives stepped into a backyard and found something no one was supposed to see. This is the haunting story of JJ and Tylee. JJ, with his bright eyes and gentle spirit, had been adopted by the family when he was just a baby. Born with drugs in his system due to his biological parents' struggles, he had spent his early days fighting for life in the neonatal intensive care unit. His autism made him need extra care and routine, but his grandfather Charles Vallow had welcomed him with open arms, giving him a loving home. Tylee, with her teenager's mix of independence and vulnerability, had already survived more than most kids her age. She had watched her family navigate divorce, custody battles, and the complex dynamics that come with blended families. Yet she remained protective of her little brother, often looking out for him when the adults seemed distracted by their own dramas. The morning of September 8, 2019, started like any other family outing. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan adjusted her phone camera as she stood next to her 7-year-old brother JJ at Yellowstone National Park. The autumn sun cast golden light across the landscape as their mother, Charles Vallow, smiled for the photo. But behind Lori's warm smile lay secrets that would shatter this picture-perfect moment forever. What happened next would change everything. To understand how this family fell apart, we need to go back to when the cracks first appeared. Charles Vallow hadn't always been the woman who would become known as Doomsday Mom. She had been a beauty queen contestant, a hairdresser, a mother who seemed to care deeply about her children. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. It started with books. In 2015, Lori discovered the apocalyptic writings of Chad Daybell, a Mormon author who claimed to have visions of the end times. His books painted vivid pictures of a world on the brink of destruction, where only the righteous would survive. For Lori, these weren't just stories, they became her new reality. Chad wasn't just any author. He was a man who claimed to have died and come back to life multiple times, each experience giving him supernatural insights. He spoke of past lives, of being married to important biblical figures, of receiving messages from beyond. To most people, these claims would sound like fantasy. To Lori, they sounded like divine truth. Meanwhile, Lori's husband Charles was growing increasingly worried. The woman he had married was disappearing, replaced by someone who spoke in riddles about spirits and missions. She told him he was possessed by a dark entity called Ned Schneider. She claimed she was a goddess destined to lead 144,000 people through the apocalypse. When Charles tried to reason with her, she made a chilling declaration. If he stood in the way of her divine mission, she would kill him. Charles filed for divorce and secretly changed his $1 million life insurance policy, removing Lori as the beneficiary. He was that afraid of his own wife. But Charles had no idea how far Lori had already fallen into Chad's web of influence. October 2018. Preparing a People conference in Utah brought together believers in the approaching end times. Among the attendees was Lori, accompanied by her new friends Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines. They had come to hear various speakers discuss spiritual preparation for the last days. Then Chad Daybell took the stage. Witnesses later described the electricity in the room when Chad spoke. He wasn't just another author, he was a prophet, a visionary who claimed direct communication with the divine. But when his eyes met Lori's across the crowded conference room, something more than spiritual awakening occurred. After his presentation, Lori approached Chad. Their conversation went far beyond theological discussion. Chad told her something that would change her life forever. They had been married in multiple past lives. She had been Elena to his James, Mary French to his spiritual guidance, the wife of biblical prophets across centuries of existence. To anyone else, this might have sounded like an elaborate pickup line. To Lori, it was divine revelation. Within days, they were communicating constantly. Chad painted a picture of their cosmic destiny together, their role in the coming apocalypse, their eternal love stories spanning multiple lifetimes. He told her she was a goddess, that she had special powers, that the world would end in July 2020 and only they could lead the faithful to safety. But their divine romance had earthly obstacles. Charles Vallow and Chad's wife Tammy Daybell. In Chad's spiritual system, this wasn't just an affair, it was a divine mission being blocked by dark forces. He had a solution for that problem too. What happened next revealed the true horror of Chad and Lori's beliefs. They developed a system for categorizing people as either light or dark based on spiritual vibrations. Each person in their lives received a score, determining their spiritual worth and, ultimately, their right to exist. Those in light are people were connected to Jesus Christ and served the divine mission, while people in dark were possessed by evil spirits and worked for Satan. But there was a third category that chilled anyone who learned about it: zombies. According to Chad and Lori's twisted theology, zombies were people whose original spirits had been replaced by dark entities. These weren't the Walking Dead of horror movies. These were living people whose souls had been taken over by evil. And once someone became a zombie, there was only one way to free them: death. The couple began holding casting sessions with their followers, elaborate prayer ceremonies designed to cast out evil spirits. They claimed they could perform these spiritual exorcisms over video calls, targeting people hundreds of miles away. Their followers eagerly participated, believing they were fighting a cosmic battle between good and evil. But as 2019 progressed, their casting sessions took on a more sinister tone. Chad and Lori began identifying more and more people in their lives as dark entities or zombies. And they started making plans to help these people by sending them to the spirit world. Charles Vallow was labeled a zombie possessed by Ned Schneider. Tammy Daybell was controlled by a spirit called Viola. And most heartbreaking of all, Chad and Lori decided that JJ and Tylee, the children who depended on them for love and protection, had also been taken over by dark spirits. July 11, 2019. The Arizona heat was already oppressive at 9 a.m. when Charles Vallow drove to his estranged wife's house in Chandler. He was there to pick up JJ for what he thought would be a normal custody visit. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. Inside the house, Lori's brother Alex Cox was waiting. Alex had always been Lori's protector, the one who fought her battles and cleaned up her messes. In 2007, he had attacked Lori's ex-husband and served 90 days in jail. Now, 12 years later, he was ready to serve his sister again. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a planned execution, though it would be staged to look like self-defense. Tylee later told police she heard arguing from her bedroom. Charles's voice, her mother's voice, and Uncle Alex's voice rising in conflict. She grabbed a baseball bat and ran toward the sound, worried about her little brother. Charles took the bat away from her, and she fled with JJ, running out of the house to escape the escalating confrontation. Then came the gunshots. When police arrived, they found Charles Vallow dead on the floor, 2 bullets in his chest. Alex Cox claimed self-defense, saying Charles had attacked him with the bat. There were no other witnesses to the actual shooting. Tylee and JJ had been outside when it happened. But the most chilling detail wasn't the violence itself. It was Lori's reaction. After her husband was shot and killed in her living room, Lori didn't call 911. She didn't appear distraught or traumatized. Instead, she took JJ to school as if nothing had happened, stopping at Burger King for breakfast and Walgreens to buy flip-flops. Police later described her behavior as oddly nonchalant, as if she was going about any ordinary day. Alex Cox eventually called 911, but only after 45 minutes had passed. When investigators reviewed the scene, they found something that would later prove crucial. Evidence showed Charles had been lying on the floor when the second bullet was fired. This wasn't a man attacking his killer, this was an execution. But at the time, the case was closed as self-defense. Charles was buried, and Lori was free to move forward with her plans. Within days, Chad sent Lori a series of romantic text messages, telling the story of James and Elena and their eternal love. While Charles's body was still warm in the morgue, Chad was crafting love letters to his widow, describing their sexual relationship in explicit detail. The first obstacle to their divine mission had been removed. By August 2019, Lori had moved to Rexburg, Idaho, with Tylee and JJ. She rented a townhouse just miles from where Chad Daybell lived with his wife Tammy. Alex Cox followed, renting his own apartment nearby. The move was presented as a fresh start after Charles's death. But the neighbors in Rexburg began to notice strange things about their new residence. JJ, who needed constant supervision because of his autism, was often left outside alone for hours. When neighbors asked about it, Lori didn't mention his special needs. Instead, she called him her niece's drug baby, as if his behavior was somehow shameful. Tylee, once a vibrant teenager, seemed to withdraw. She wasn't enrolled in any local schools despite Lori's claims that she was attending college. The girl who had once been active on social media went silent. Meanwhile, Lori and Chad's relationship intensified. They spent hours on the phone, communicating through encrypted apps and burner phones. They spoke in code about their mission and the obstacles that needed to be removed. In their twisted theology, Tylee and JJ were no longer Lori's children. They were dark spirits standing in the way of her divine calling. Chad had told followers that both children were zombies who needed to be freed from their earthly bodies. On September 8, 2019, Lori took Tylee and JJ to Yellowstone National Park. Security cameras captured the family entering the park, with Alex Cox driving. It was a beautiful day, the kind of outing that should have created happy memories. Instead, it was the last time Tylee Ryan would be seen alive. The morning after their Yellowstone trip, Tylee was gone. But unlike most missing person cases, no one reported her disappearance. No Amber Alerts went out. No frantic phone calls to police. Lori simply acted as if her daughter had never existed. 2 weeks later, on September 22nd, JJ had his final day at Kennedy Elementary School. His teachers noticed nothing unusual. JJ was his normal, energetic self. But that evening, family friends staying at Lori's home would witness something that would haunt them forever. Around 10:30 p.m., Alex Cox carried JJ upstairs to his bedroom. The boy appeared to be sleeping, his small body limp in his uncle's arms. It was the last time anyone would see JJ alive. The next morning, when the house guests asked about JJ, Lori had an explanation ready. The boy had been misbehaving, she said, so his uncle Alex had taken him away for a while. She seemed unconcerned, almost relieved. That same day, Lori called JJ's school to inform them he would be homeschooled from now on. She provided no forwarding address, no explanation of her sudden decision. The teachers who had worked so hard to help JJ thrive were left with only questions. But Lori had bigger concerns than explaining her children's disappearances. She and Chad had another obstacle to remove, and this one would require perfect timing. On October 9, 2019, Tammy Daybell was working in her yard when a man in a mask approached her. He pointed what looked like a paintball gun at her and pulled the trigger several times. The gun appeared to be empty or jammed, and the man fled. Tammy reported the incident to police, but they dismissed it as a prank. After all, Who would want to hurt a beloved librarian and mother of 5? What police didn't know was that Alex Cox's cell phone had pinged near the Daybell home 4 hours before the attack. They didn't know that Cox had been searching the internet for information about AR-15 rifles and ammunition ballistics. 10 days later, on October 19th, Chad Daybell called 911 with devastating news. His wife Tammy had died in her sleep. She'd been coughing, he said, and had seemed tired. He'd woken up to find her cold and lifeless beside him. The local coroner, influenced by Chad's calm demeanor and religious standing in the community, ruled Tammy's death natural causes. There would be no autopsy, no investigation. Chad was a grieving widower who just wanted to bury his wife and move on. But something didn't feel right to Tammy's family. Chad seemed oddly unemotional at the funeral, more businesslike than devastated. He even criticized Tammy in his eulogy, calling her lazy and difficult to live with. 3 days after Tammy's funeral, Chad introduced his children to someone new, Charles Vallow, the woman who would help him heal from his loss. The woman who, according to Chad, had recently lost a daughter and would understand his pain. The children were confused. Their father had never mentioned this woman before, yet he seemed completely taken with her. They were laughing and giggling together, more affectionate than Chad had ever been with their mother. On November 5, 2019, less than 3 weeks after Tammy's death, Chad and Lori were married in a small ceremony in Hawaii. Chad hadn't told his family about the wedding beforehand. They discovered his new marriage only when they met his bride. What no one knew was that Lori had been planning the wedding for months. Internet records would later show that she had ordered wedding rings in August 2019, while Tammy was still alive. She had searched for wedding dresses on the day of Tammy's funeral. The divine mission was coming together perfectly. Charles was dead. Tammy was dead. And now Tylee and JJ were gone too. All the obstacles to Chad and Lori's apocalyptic destiny had been removed. But their perfect plan was about to unravel. On November 26, 2019, police knocked on Lori's door in Rexburg. JJ's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, hadn't heard from her grandson in months. She was worried and had asked police to do a welfare check. The officers found Chad Daybell and Alex Cox at the house, both acting nervous and evasive. When asked about JJ, they gave contradictory stories. Cox claimed the boy was with his grandmother in Arizona. Chad, who was supposed to be Lori's husband, said he barely knew her and was just visiting as a friend. When police finally reached Lori, she said JJ was in Arizona with her friend Melanie Gibb. But when officers contacted Gibb, she said she hadn't seen JJ in months. She was confused by the question and worried about the boy she'd grown to love. That night, neighbors watched as Lori and Alex Cox loaded boxes into a truck outside her home. By morning, the house was empty. Lori and Chad had fled to Hawaii, leaving behind only questions and growing suspicions. Police began connecting the dots. Charles Vallow's death in Arizona. Tammy Daybell's sudden death in Idaho. 2 missing children. And now 2 adults who had refused to cooperate with law enforcement and instead had fled across the Pacific Ocean. On December 20, 2019, police held a press conference that would change everything. They announced that Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow were officially missing and asked for the public's help in finding them. The story exploded across national media. A beautiful mother, a doomsday author, and 2 missing children. The public was captivated and horrified. Family members went on television pleading for information. Charles's sister Kay Woodcock offered a $20,000 reward. JJ's older brother Colby begged his mother to bring the children home. But Lori and Chad remained silent in their Hawaiian paradise, living off the life insurance money from Tammy's death. When reporters confronted them outside their gated community, they refused to answer questions about the children's whereabouts. "Where are the kids?" reporters shouted. but Lori and Chad simply walked away, their faces revealing nothing. While Lori and Chad enjoyed Hawaiian beaches, law enforcement agencies across multiple states were working around the clock to find Tylee and JJ. They traced cell phone records, analyzed financial transactions, and interviewed dozens of witnesses. A picture began to emerge of a religious group that had spiraled into deadly fanaticism. Former friends described Lori's transformation from loving mother to religious zealot. They talked about casting ceremonies where the group tried to expel evil spirits. They described a belief system where killing zombies was not just acceptable but necessary. Investigators learned about the light and dark classification system. They discovered that Lori had been collecting Social Security survivor benefits for both children even after they disappeared. They found evidence that she had been accessing Tylee's bank accounts, making it appear the teenager was still alive. Most chilling of all, they found text messages between Lori and Chad discussing their perfectly orchestrated plan to deal with the children. The messages referred to Z's, zombies, and made it clear that Tylee and JJ were viewed as obstacles to be eliminated. In February 2020, police arrested Lori in Hawaii on charges of child desertion and non-support. She was extradited back to Idaho, where she sat in jail refusing to reveal what had happened to her children. Chad returned to Idaho but remained free. He tried to convince neighbors to put up their homes as collateral for Lori's bond, claiming Jesus had told him to do so. When pressed about the children, he spoke about Tylee in the past tense, as if she were already dead. Meanwhile, investigators were tracking the cell phone records of Alex Cox, Lori's brother who had already died of natural causes in December 2019. The data would lead them to a horrifying discovery. On the morning of June 9, 2020, investigators arrived at Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg with search warrants and cadaver dogs. They had spent months analyzing Alex Cox's cell phone data, looking for clues about where Tylee and JJ might be. The data showed that Cox's phone had pinged at Chad's property on two crucial dates: September 9, 2019, the day after Tylee was last seen, and September 23, 2019, the day after JJ disappeared. The search team focused on two areas of Chad's backyard. The first was what the Daybell family called their pet cemetery, where they had buried cats and dogs over the years. The second was near a pond at the edge of the property. As investigators began digging in the pet cemetery, they found something that would haunt them forever. Buried in the ground, hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris, were the charred remains of a teenage girl. The bones were fractured and scattered. The hands had been cut off. Someone had tried to burn the body beyond recognition and then attempted to dismember what remained. But dental records would confirm what everyone already knew. This was 16-year-old Tylee Ryan. Near the pond, investigators made an even more heartbreaking discovery. Wrapped carefully in plastic and buried under rocks and wooden planks was the body of 7-year-old JJ Vallow. Unlike his sister, JJ had been buried with what seemed like care. His body was intact, dressed in red pajamas. But the cause of death was horrific. He had been suffocated with a plastic bag and duct tape over his mouth. The sight of JJ's small body, carefully wrapped and buried, suggested that even in death, someone had felt protective of the little boy. But forensic evidence would tell a different story about who was responsible. As investigators processed the crime scene, they found evidence that would tie the murders directly to the people who claimed to love these children. Tylee's DNA was found on a pickaxe and shovel seized from Chad's property. The tools had been used to dismember her body after she was killed. On JJ's remains, investigators found Alex Cox's fingerprints on the plastic wrapping. They also found strands of Lori's hair attached to the duct tape that had been placed over the boy's mouth. The physical evidence painted a horrifying picture. Alex Cox had likely killed both children, but he hadn't acted alone. Lori had been present when JJ was murdered, close enough that her hair became entangled in the tape used to silence her adopted son forever. But the evidence went deeper than just physical traces. Investigators found text messages between Chad and his wife Tammy from September 9, 2019, the day Tylee died. Chad had texted Tammy that he had shot a large raccoon in their backyard that morning and buried it in the pet cemetery. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Raccoons are nocturnal animals. They don't typically wander into backyards during daylight hours. Chad was providing himself with an alibi for why he might be seen digging a grave in his backyard. As Chad watched investigators uncover the children's bodies, he called Lori in jail to warn her about what was happening. Then he tried to drive away from the scene, but police chased him down and arrested him for concealing evidence. The man who had claimed to be a prophet, who had convinced followers he could see the future, apparently hadn't foreseen this moment when his crimes would be exposed to the world. The legal proceedings that followed would span years and multiple states. In May 2021, Chad and Lori were charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy Daybell. But the case was about more than just 3 murders. It was about a belief system so twisted that it allowed parents to kill their own children in the name of religion. It was about manipulation, greed, and the deadly consequences of unchecked fanaticism. Lori's trial began in April 2023. For the first time, the public heard the full scope of her transformation from devoted mother to Doomsday mom. Former friends testified about her bizarre beliefs and threats. They described a woman who had become convinced she was a goddess with the power to decide who lived and who died. The prosecution presented evidence of Lori's financial motives. She had continued collecting Social Security benefits for both children after their deaths. She had accessed Tylee's bank accounts to make it appear the teenager was still alive. She had benefited from Charles's life insurance policy, even though she didn't know he had changed the beneficiary before his death. But perhaps most damaging was the testimony about Lori's religious beliefs. Witnesses described how she had classified her own children as zombies who needed to be eliminated. They told the court about casting ceremonies where group members prayed for the deaths of people deemed possessed by evil spirits. Lori's defense team argued that she had been manipulated by Chad Daybell, that she was under his psychological control and not fully responsible for her actions. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Text messages showed that Lori was an active participant in planning the murders. She had searched the internet for wedding dresses while Tammy was still alive. She had ordered wedding rings months before Tammy's death. She had made it clear to friends that her children were obstacles to her divine mission. On May 12, 2023, the jury found Lori guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell's trial began in April 2024. The prosecution painted him as a man motivated by sex, money, and power who used religion to justify murder. They argued that he had manipulated Lori and Alex Cox, convincing them to kill anyone who stood in the way of his apocalyptic fantasies. The defense tried to portray Chad as a victim of Lori's manipulation, claiming he had been lured into adultery and then trapped in a web of violence. They argued that Alex Cox was the real killer, acting as Lori's protector and enforcer. But the evidence against Chad was overwhelming. His cell phone data placed him at the scene of the children's murders. His text messages revealed his role in planning the deaths. His financial records showed he had benefited from insurance payouts after the murders. Perhaps most damning was the testimony about Chad's religious teachings. Witnesses described how he had classified people as light or dark and taught that killing zombies was justified. Former followers testified that Chad had specifically identified Tylee, JJ, and Tammy as dark spirits who needed to be eliminated. On May 30, 2024, The jury found Chad guilty on all counts. Unlike Lori, he was sentenced to death. The man who had claimed to be a prophet chosen by God would face the ultimate earthly judgment for his crimes. The Vallow case sent shockwaves through religious communities across America. It raised difficult questions about the line between faith and fanaticism, about how seemingly normal people could be led to commit unspeakable acts in the name of religion. For the families of the victims, the convictions brought some measure of justice but could never heal the profound grief they continued to carry. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, had fought tirelessly to find their grandson and see his killers brought to justice. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son, struggled to reconcile the mother he had loved with the woman who had murdered his siblings. In interviews, he spoke about the warning signs he had missed, the gradual changes in his mother's behavior that had led to this tragedy. Chad's children faced their own trauma, learning that their father had not only killed their mother but had also murdered 2 innocent children. Some continued to defend him, unable to accept the reality of his crimes. The case also highlighted the dangers of extremist religious groups operating on the fringes of mainstream faith communities. Law enforcement agencies began developing new strategies for identifying and monitoring such groups before they could turn violent. Even after her conviction in Idaho, Lori still faced charges in Arizona for the murders of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. In a stunning move, she chose to represent herself in these trials, believing she could convince juries of her innocence. The Arizona trials in 2025 revealed new details about the scope of the conspiracy. Prosecutors showed how Lori had methodically planned the elimination of anyone who threatened her relationship with Chad or her access to insurance money. During her trial for Charles's murder, Lori maintained that her brother Alex had acted in self-defense. But the evidence told a different story. Charles had been shot twice, once while lying on the floor. Alex had staged the scene to make it appear that Charles had been the aggressor. The jury saw through Lori's lies. On April 22, 2025, she was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in Charles's death. In her second Arizona trial, she was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder in the attempted killing of Brandon Boudreaux. These convictions ensured that even if Lori's Idaho convictions were somehow overturned, she would never walk free. The woman who had once believed she was a goddess destined to survive the apocalypse would spend the rest of her life in prison. As the legal proceedings finally ended, many questions remained unanswered. How had Chad Daybell, a small-time author and cemetery worker, managed to convince multiple people to commit murder? How had Lori Vallow, once a devoted mother, been transformed into someone capable of killing her own children? Mental health experts suggested that both Chad and Lori had exhibited signs of shared psychotic disorder, feeding off each other's delusions until they lost touch with reality. Their apocalyptic beliefs had created a closed system where murder could be justified as divine will. The case also raised questions about the role of fringe religious communities in enabling such extremism. Chad and Lori had found followers among people who were already predisposed to believe in end-times prophecies and supernatural experiences. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that the murders could have been prevented. There were warning signs that family members and friends had noticed but failed to act upon. Charles Vallow had tried to warn authorities about his wife's increasingly dangerous behavior, but the system had failed to protect him or the children. Today, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow are remembered not as victims of a doomsday cult, but as beloved children whose lives were cut tragically short. Tylee was a creative, independent teenager who loved art and music. JJ was a joyful little boy who brought happiness to everyone he met despite the challenges of his autism. Charles Vallow is remembered as a devoted father who died trying to protect his family. Tammy Daybell is remembered as a loving mother, teacher, and librarian who dedicated her life to helping others learn and grow. Their deaths were not part of some divine plan or cosmic mission. They were the result of human evil, of greed and manipulation disguised as religious faith. The people who killed them were not prophets or goddesses, but ordinary individuals who chose the path of violence and destruction. The Vallow case serves as a stark reminder of how quickly love can turn to obsession, how faith can be twisted into fanaticism, and how the most vulnerable among us, children, can become victims of adults who have lost their way. In the end, Chad Daybell's prophecy about the world ending in July 2020 proved false. The world continued, but the lives of Tylee, JJ, Charles, and Tammy had ended long before that predicted date. Their memory lives on in the hearts of those who truly loved them, and in the determination of law enforcement and prosecutors to ensure that such tragedies never happen again.